Story 1. That night I sat in my small room, the walls swallowed by shadows and the air smelling of dust and old books. The house was silent, and if you listened closely, the only sound you could hear was the steady sound of my breathing, mingling with the sounds coming from the street. I loved the silence. It was calming, it made me feel safe. But then, in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible, lurking in the dark corners of the room, was watching me. With each passing year, I found myself alone in this house more and more often. My parents' former home, now my inheritance, was huge, with many dark and abandoned corners. But I didn't complain. It was better than the noise and bustle of the world outside these walls. My only company was my books and the thoughts that wandered through my head while I went about my business. I was used to being alone, and although the loneliness could sometimes seem burdensome, it was a part of me. But something had changed recently. For several weeks I had been feeling a strange uneasiness more and more often. An unknown sense of unease had been with me day and night. I tried to explain it by saying that I was missing people, that the house, despite its size, was becoming stuffy and cramped. But these explanations could not rid me of the strange feeling that there was something wrong in the air. There was a feeling that I was not alone in this house. It started with noises at night. At first I thought they were just old pipes, but each time they became more and more distinct. Cracking, creaking footsteps. I even tried to check if some of the furniture or even the house itself was giving way under the influence of time, but nothing changed. The sounds kept coming. Sometimes I would wake up in the night hearing them, and then go back to bed with a feeling of fear running down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I began to think that it might be stress or fatigue because I often worked late and maybe my brain just couldn't handle the stress. But one night, as I lay in the dark again, I noticed something strange. I felt a gaze, not on the conscious level, but somewhere in the subcortex. I looked into the dark corner of my room, the part one thought was the safest, the most peaceful. But there was nothing there, and yet I knew that someone or something was watching me. I got out of bed and walked slowly toward that corner. In the darkness I could only make out the outlines of furniture, an old lamp and a closet. But in the very depths, where there had never been anything to worry about, I felt cold. It wasn't just physical, like if the window were open. It was an unimaginable cold that made your heart beat faster. I came closer, cautiously stretched out my hand, trying to feel the darkness. But nothing happened. I felt only my own pulse, as if its beats could be heard throughout the room. I didn't know what to do. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing these sounds, and with each new day they became louder and clearer. But the next morning I woke up and again didn't notice anything strange. It was like a bad dream, where everything around is normal, but deep down something torments you. That day I went to the basement. There I kept old things, books, and some personal things that I didn't use. But when I opened the basement door, the air smelled of damp and dust. It was the same smell I always associated with this place, dark and hidden, as if not meant for human eyes. I turned on the light and looked around. Everything was in order, except for one thing. An old cabinet that I never opened was slightly open. At first I thought it was just that I forgot to close it, but something inside me told me that was not the case. I carefully approached the closet and looked inside. Nothing. Empty. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but at that moment I felt something cold touch my hand. I jerked it away, feeling my heart pounding, but still there was nothing. The closet remained empty. I sighed and felt stupid, although the fear didn't go away. I quickly closed the closet and went back upstairs. The next morning I decided I needed to get it over with and finally figure out what was going on. I went to the local library and asked for a book on the paranormal. They gave me an old book and wished me luck. I started reading, and the more I delved into it, the more I became convinced that the house really was hiding something. I didn't know what it was, but something inside me told me that I was on the verge of something great and scary. I decided to stay the night. Maybe if I waited I could find out what lurked in the dark corners of this house. Something was pulling me toward this challenge, and I knew that if I retreated, I would never be free of this fear. That night, I found myself alone again, with the same sounds and the feeling that the house was not just old, it was alive. And I was not prepared for it to consume me. Several days passed, and I continued to feel haunted. My sleep became even more restless, and the nights became endlessly long. This time I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the house that I couldn't understand or control. The anxiety that lived inside me grew stronger with each passing day. I was sure that the house wasn't just old and abandoned, it was alive, and its presence was becoming more and more noticeable with each passing day. I tried to ignore these feelings, trying to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination. But the more I tried, the stronger this fear became. One day I decided that I needed to figure this out. I started looking for information about the house and its history, hoping to find at least something that could explain what was happening. I turned over a bunch of old documents, photographs, and records, but I found nothing unusual. The house was built a long time ago, and there were no records of strange events or occurrences. That night I sat in my chair in the living room again, trying to collect my thoughts. The air was cold, and I wrapped myself in a blanket, but it didn't help. The sounds began to repeat themselves: footsteps, soft rustling sounds, something moving across the floor. I stood up and headed toward the hallway where the sounds usually began. It was dark and long, and I felt its darkness swallowing me up as I walked along its sides. Suddenly I felt something freeze in the air. It was that moment when all sounds disappear and you are left alone, absorbed by something invisible. I stopped and looked around, but everything seemed normal. However, something inside me contracted. I could not explain this feeling, but it was so strong that I could not resist it. I turned towards the old stairs leading to the second floor and began to climb. At that moment, it seemed to me that I felt someone's gaze watching me, but I could not believe it because there was not a single living creature around me. On the top floor, I felt that terrible cold again. It was coming from the door of the room I always avoided. It was a room I had never been in, and I didn't know what was in there. I stood in front of it and thought that maybe this was the part of the house where all the strange things happen. I didn't know what was in there, and it was impossible to be afraid. I couldn't stand by the door forever, so I made up my mind. I took the handle and opened it. The door creaked open in front of me. It was dark in the room, and I couldn't see anything. Suddenly, I felt the room fill with a special feeling. The air became heavy, as if I was in some other place. That same cold I was talking about penetrated every cell of my body, and I froze. The room was not abandoned, as I thought. There was an old table on the floor, covered in a layer of dust. But the strangest thing was that there was a photograph on the table. I came closer, trying not to touch anything in the room, but I recognized myself in the photograph. It was a photograph of myself, taken many years ago when I was still a child. I felt the blood drain from my face, and my heart began to beat wildly. How could this photo be here? I couldn't answer that question, but I knew one thing: something was wrong with this place. I grabbed the photo and looked at it carefully, but then I felt someone pass by me. I froze and looked around. The darkness was full of something inhuman, and all I could do at that moment was just stand and wait. The feeling that I was not alone became almost unbearable. I hurried out of the room, closing the door behind me. I went back downstairs and sat down in the chair again. My head was buzzing with thoughts that wouldn't let me rest. The photograph, the strange sounds, the sensations, all of it had merged into something big and scary. I decided that maybe I needed to go back to that room to figure out what was happening, but fear paralyzed me. I couldn't go there again. That night, despite all the anxiety, I tried to sleep. But even with my eyes closed, I felt the shadows in the room come alive. I knew it wasn't just lack of sleep or fatigue. It was more than I could understand. I wasn't the master of this house. It was the master of me. With each passing minute, I became more and more convinced that there was something hidden here, and I felt that I would never be able to get rid of this feeling until I found out what it was. The night after I found the photograph was a difficult test for me. Sleep did not come, despite all my efforts to relax. Fragments of thoughts constantly flashed through my head, and my breathing was rapid, like that of an animal that senses danger. I found myself alone again in this house, which now seemed alive to me, full of hidden secrets and dark corners. Every movement in the house was like an answer to my unspoken questions. I didn't know what to do. Every day the house was swallowing me up more and more. This place had become not just a refuge for me, but also a prison. But something inside me wouldn't let me leave. I knew I had to solve this riddle to free myself from these terrible feelings. The next few days passed in the same anxious state. I increasingly looked for excuses for what was happening, but to no avail. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was losing my mind, that these feelings were just the result of sleepless nights and endless thoughts. But despite this, I knew that the house did not stop being strange. It became more and more sinister, and I could not escape the feeling that something or someone was watching me. One morning, after another sleepless night, I decided to do something that might help me figure out what was going on. I picked up an old diary that once belonged to my parents and started reading its pages. The pages were written chaotically, with many notes and entries that seemed meaningless. But among them, I noticed several strange phrases that caught my attention. Some of them were related to the place where I was now. "The shadows in the house are watching us," one of the entries read. I paused for a second, trying to figure out what that meant. But then, as if nothing else mattered, I continued reading. "The door on the second floor hides something that should not be found. If you open it, it could be your undoing." The second entry sent a chill down my spine. I already knew which door it was. It was the place I hadn't dared to look. But now I couldn't ignore those words. There was something important in the diary that I had to understand. I left the diary on the table and headed for the stairs without waiting for my thoughts to finish. Everything was mixed up in my head, and I knew one thing: I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find out the truth. Every step in the hallway echoed in my head. There was only one question left in my head. What was this door hiding? Why was it closed, despite the rest of the house being abandoned and left in the shadows? As I approached the second staircase, I slowed down. With each turn of the hallway, I felt as if the house was pulling me into its dark maw. It was a strange feeling, as if I were truly becoming a part of this place. I stood in front of the door that had become a symbol of everything unknown and scary to me. My hand trembled as I touched the handle, but I knew there was no turning back. I opened the door. The door creaked open with difficulty, as if resisting what was to be revealed. It was dark inside. I turned on the light, but even the bright illumination could not awaken the room from its eclipse. When I entered, the air became cold and heavy. It seemed to wrap around me like a spider's web, not allowing me to move freely. I stood in the middle of the room, looking around, but I could not understand anything. Then I noticed there was an old chest in the corner. It was covered in dust and cobwebs. Its surfaces were cracked, and it looked like it hadn't been opened for years. But something about it caught my eye. I walked over and carefully opened the lid. Inside, Among many old things, I noticed a small package wrapped in red cloth. My heart pounded as I picked it up. The fabric was cold as metal. I untied the knot and unwrapped the package. Inside was a mirror. It was small, old, with a darkened frame. But when I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. In the mirror, I saw only a dark void that seemed bottomless. It wasn't just a dark corner of the room. It was something more. The mirror was empty, but it was magnetic, making me feel like it was pulling me towards it, as if it were a portal to another place. I couldn't look away. Fear and curiosity mixed into one feeling that made me take steps forward despite internal resistance. It was something unimaginable, something that shouldn't exist in this world, but I was already standing in front of it. The mirror began to flicker, and I felt my body begin to cool. With each passing second, the cold became stronger, as if I were becoming part of this emptiness. I took a step back, but as soon as I tore myself away from the mirror, the cold disappeared. I stood in a room I no longer wanted to return to. The chest was closed, and as soon as I turned away, I knew I could no longer escape what I was about to learn. When I found myself back in the room, the feeling was different. The dark corner of the room where the mirror stood no longer seemed to be just a part of the house, but something that held me in its gravitational pull. Even the air here was special, heavier, denser, as if it had thickened and become an invisible barrier. My hand reached for the door handle, but something inside me made me freeze. At that moment, I realized that I didn't want to look into that mirror again. I wanted to move away, but at the same time I knew that would be an escape. I stood in front of the door, feeling how every moment in this house was pulling me into the unknown. And yet I opened it. The door creaked, as if complaining about my presence. The room was dark again. Only the dim light from the corridor barely penetrated the threshold, but it was enough to see the silhouette of a mirror standing in the corner. The mirror was still dark and cold. It seemed to absorb the light. Its surface remained matte, and I felt something unknown pulling me. I stepped into the room, but I could not take my eyes off this object. With each step, I felt my heart begin to beat faster, and my mind tried to evade reality. This strange object in the room was more than just a mirror. It was the center of this universe, connecting the space around me to something else, something I could not understand. When I went back to the mirror, I noticed that it wasn't just me that was reflected. It showed me something that wasn't there. I looked the same as always, but there was something else in the reflection, a dark spot, vague and indistinct, like a silhouette lurking in the darkness. I froze, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. It moved, as if it were watching me. I tried to look away, but as soon as I did, the image in the mirror didn't disappear, it remained, even when I wasn't looking at it. I stepped back, feeling the cold envelop me. It was a strange and terrible feeling. No logic could explain what was happening. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I needed to get out, but my legs didn't seem to obey me. I was becoming more and more vulnerable with each passing moment. There was only one thought in my head. What if this isn't just a mirror? What if this is a window to another place, another time? I turned abruptly and ran out of the room, closing the door behind me with a bang. The state I was experiencing was inexplicable. As I stood in the hallway, I could still feel the presence of something dark pressing upon me. I glanced at the door, but did not dare approach it again. My thoughts were fragmented, and I did not know what to do. I needed to leave, but what if I could not? What if this thing had already taken me? I was bombarded with questions. Why couldn't I leave? Why couldn't I just leave this house and everything connected to it? And what were these forces that chained me to this place? I felt the tension growing, and I couldn't find an answer. With each passing minute, the tension in the house grew. It seemed that its walls were not just surrounding me, they were pressing, squeezing me like a cage. But what was really happening? Maybe this was not just my perception, but something real, unknown and terrible that was penetrating me through all these walls. I did not know, but I was sure that I needed to stay to understand what was happening. I needed to solve this riddle. Otherwise, I would not be able to escape from all this. I spent several hours sitting in a dark room where nothing else was happening. It seemed like nothing had changed, but at the same time I felt like every moment here was making me lose the very essence of reality. I decided to go back to the mirror again to find the answer to this question, not knowing what was happening, but rather feeling helpless. When I returned to the room, the light was on. I couldn't understand how it had happened. I stood by the door staring into the mirror as if it could swallow me, and again, in its dark reflection, a silhouette appeared. This time I saw it more clearly, a face. It wasn't mine, but I knew it was familiar. Not someone in particular, but rather something that was part of me. It was like a nagging memory you can't erase, like a thought that keeps coming back. I stepped towards the mirror and extended my hand, not thinking about the consequences. My hand slid along the surface of the glass, and at that moment I felt my body turn cold. This sensation was strange, but it could not be real. I immediately pulled my hand back, but the cold did not leave me. I stood in front of the mirror, and it, in turn, seemed to be waiting for me. I realized that I couldn't leave this house without understanding what the mirror was hiding, but understanding this only increased my anxiety. What I saw in it was not something I could explain. It was not just an image, but something more than I could understand. But what was it? And why was it not letting me go? I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was out of my control. I felt like I had stepped into something much darker and more dangerous than just an abandoned house. This wasn't a nightmare or a hallucination. This was reality, and it was somehow connected to this mirror. Every time I tried to return to normal life, it pushed me away. Work moments, familiar concerns, everything seemed distant and unimportant. I could no longer focus on everyday affairs. My life turned into a continuous shadow in which I could find neither light nor peace. After I encountered that horrible reflection again, I decided to take a step back. I tried to ignore the mirror, to ignore it, but every day it became more and more insistent. When I wasn't looking at it, I felt like it was watching me, as if it was ready to swallow me up at any moment. And I knew it wasn't just fear. It was something more real, something that was present next to me. It was like I was in the grip of an invisible force, and that force didn't want to let me go. It took a few days before I decided to do something more drastic. I stood in front of the mirror, staring into its dark glass. I was ready now. Even though I was scared, I knew I couldn't run. I had to figure out what was happening. Why couldn't I get away from this? Why did the mirror keep calling to me? I felt the cold creeping into my bones again, as if it wasn't just reflecting me, but absorbing all my senses. And so, standing before it, I took the first step. I reached out my hand, and as if something in me gave in, I touched the glass. The cold penetrated me instantly, and in that moment I realized that this was not just glass. It was something more. It had become a part of me, as if I myself were a part of this mirror. As soon as I touched it, I felt the world around me change. Everything began to blur. The space around me began to distort, as if it was crumbling into sand. I tried to retreat, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I stood there, engulfed in this dark force, unable to leave. What was before me was not just a reflection. It was a portal, a window into another dimension, and I was in it. Suddenly I was in another room, in another reality. Everything was still dark and cold, but I was not alone. Something stood in the corner, a presence vague and threatening. It was not just a reflection, it was a real world into which I was absorbed. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as if the very air here was holding me back. I was surrounded by this unknown world, and the feeling was terrifyingly familiar. I was trapped, a trap of my own making. My heart was beating faster. I tried to understand what this place was, but all my thoughts merged into one single emptiness. I could neither think nor speak. This was not like a dream. This was something more, something I could not understand. I began to realize that the mirror was not just a portal to another space. It was some kind of in-between state, some place where the boundaries between worlds were erased. It was a place where reality and imagination intersected, and I found myself at the center of that intersection. I did not know where I began and where this world ended. Time lost all meaning. My hands were cold, and even breathing was difficult. I couldn't move, couldn't see, couldn't understand what was happening. But I knew one thing: I had to get out of here. I had to get back to my world, to my reality. I was ready to fight, no matter what was happening. The forces that had been holding me began to let go. I felt the air filling my lungs again, and I was able to take the first step. At that moment, I found myself in front of the mirror again. It was a normal mirror again, not the dark portal I had just entered. I stood there, staring at his reflection, trying to figure out what had just happened. Was it real? Or was it just a dream? A stress-induced hallucination? But I knew it was more than that. I had witnessed something I couldn't explain. I left the room, but the feeling of heaviness did not leave me. It haunted me like a shadow, and I knew it was not over. The mirror continued to beckon me. It was not just an object, but a part of my reality, a part of my world, and I could not escape from it. I returned to my room, but I knew that this was only the beginning. The world I knew was no longer the same. Several days passed, and I continued to feel this constant, inescapable cold that would not leave me. It seemed as if not a single detail in this house remained the same. The walls with their peeling paint, the floor covered in dust, all these familiar elements now seemed alien and strange, as if they did not belong here. But the scariest thing was that I could not shake the feeling that the mirror continued to watch me. It had become a part of my existence, a part of me. It knew when I felt afraid, when I tried to leave. And with each passing day, it became more insistent. I couldn't just walk past a room without looking in the mirror anymore. No matter how hard I tried, I always found myself standing in front of it, in a dark corner, its dark surface absorbing the light. And in that reflection, I saw not only myself, but something else, a silhouette that moved as I moved, as if it were me, but not quite. Today I found myself in front of the mirror again. My body was shaking with fear, but I knew I couldn't leave anymore. I needed to understand what was behind this horror. I needed to see what this portal, this dark glass, was hiding. I touched it again, and at that moment I felt the same cold, the same ominous flow that was pulling me in. This time, when I looked into the reflection, I saw more than just a silhouette. It was clear and distinct, standing right in front of me, looking at me with eyes that were not mine. Those eyes were not afraid, they were empty and lifeless. It was the gaze of the mirror itself, a gaze that could not belong to anyone who was alive. I flinched back, but my body wouldn't listen. It kept moving forward, as if someone or something was pulling me into the mirror. I tried to resist, but step by step I lost control of my body more and more. Suddenly I found myself inside, in the same dark space I had seen before. It wasn't just a world I found myself in. It was a void with no beginning or end. The darkness around me grew thicker, consuming all my thoughts and feelings. I tried to scream, but the sounds did not reach me, as if I were in an abyss, in a place where there is no sound. I tried to move, but I could not. I felt my body being wrapped in an unknown force, as if this place was becoming a part of me. I tried to understand what was happening. What was this place? Why did it exist? I searched for an explanation, but found nothing. Every move, every step only increased my anxiety. But was this reality? I no longer knew. I was trapped in this place, unable to leave. With each passing moment, the darkness grew thicker, and suddenly I realized I was not alone. This place was filled with something that was watching me. In the corner, at the edge of visibility, I noticed a figure. It stood motionless, but I felt that it was there, close by. I tried to move towards it, but every step I took was fruitless. I could not get any closer. The shadow was too far away, and all I saw was like a haze, a vague outline that disappeared as soon as I tried to touch it. I tried to believe that it was just a dream, that everything that was happening was a game of my mind. But the longer I stayed here, the more I became convinced that this was real. It was a reality that I couldn't cope with. I couldn't figure out what to do, how to get out of this place. I couldn't even figure out where this place was. It was as if this was a test, a cruel test, testing my strength. I tried to think of a way out, of how I could get back, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts were blurry, as if I was drowning in this space, being consumed by it. At some point, I felt the shadow begin to move. It was approaching me. There was no sound, no movement, only a shadow that was becoming more and more distinct. I felt my heart begin to beat faster, and intuitively I stepped back. But something inside me wouldn't let me leave. My will was fading, and I knew I couldn't escape it. The shadow came closer, and I felt a chill that made me shrink. It was standing next to me, and I knew it wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't my shadow. It was someone else standing right in front of me. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. Time seemed to stop, and I was left alone with this creature, with this terrible reflection. My consciousness was consumed. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I knew one thing. I was in a place where there was no way out, where there was no light, where there was nothing but this reflection. When I finally came to, I couldn't immediately understand what was happening. Time had flowed like a viscous liquid, and I couldn't remember how much time had passed since I had found myself in this strange world. I was in darkness, but not the kind that reigned around the mirror. It was emptiness, endless and incorporeal. Even the air seemed thickened, as if I were trying to breathe through viscous space. I stood there, feeling my body grow heavier and my mind grow more confused. I knew I was in a different place, but that fact brought me no relief. This wasn't just another space, it was another level of reality, where the laws of time and space seemed to cease to apply. I couldn't figure out where I was or how to get out. When I tried to move, movement was difficult. My body resisted, as if I was trying to overcome an invisible barrier that prevented me from moving freely. My legs barely moved, and my breathing became more rapid and restless. I was surrounded by a dark, dense substance that was consuming me, making me feel as if I was stuck in some nightmare where neither time nor space existed. And then I heard something. It wasn't a word, not a sound, just a vibration echoing in that emptiness. It was familiar and alien at the same time, as if I had heard the sound long ago but couldn't remember where it came from. It was a whisper, so quiet that it would have been barely perceptible if it hadn't felt like it was penetrating deep inside me, touching every cell of my body. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing: I had to go where that sound was coming from. Even though I didn't understand what it meant, I had no choice. I was like a blind man who, despite his muteness, goes in the direction where he finds the only thread of hope. With each step, the darkness grew thicker, but the sound guided me. It continued to grow, filling me with a sense of inevitability, as if I were not just a spectator but a part of something greater. I began to feel the whispers seeping into my thoughts, my feelings pulling them to the surface. When I reached the center of this emptiness, I saw it. It was not a creature in the usual sense of the word, but something that could barely be called alive. At first I thought it was a shadow, but then I realized it was not just a shadow, it was something that was reflected in the emptiness, like a black hole, absorbing everything around it. I couldn't breathe, but I stood there, not looking away. I could feel my body tense, as if it instinctively knew I was facing something terrible. The shape was dark, but it wasn't enough to encompass the void. It was part of something much bigger than I could have imagined. And then this creature spoke. I couldn't say I heard his words, because they weren't ordinary words. It was more like a transmission of thoughts, a stream of emotions that passed through me, as if I were part of him. "You have come," he whispered, his voice an echo without form or clarity. "What are you?" I tried to ask, but my voice didn't reach me. I couldn't figure out if I was alive now, or if this was some other experience where I had no control over my words and actions. "I am part of what you are looking for. I am what you do not understand, but what exists inside you. You came here because you cannot give up your pain. You cannot let go of what you took from yourself. And now you will stay here forever." I felt the words seeping into me, taking over my thoughts. I felt cold, unbearably cold, and suddenly I realized that what I was feeling wasn't just fear. It was a part of me, a part of what I had been trying to avoid all this time. The pain, the loneliness, the uncertainty. All of these feelings had become part of this being that stood before me. I tried to retreat, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed. I stood in this place surrounded by this monstrous reflection of my own fear, and I could neither move nor get out. "You will not leave," the creature said again, and its words sounded like a sentence. And in that moment I realized that I was trapped, a trap that I had created when I opened the door to this place. The mirror was not just a passage, it was my prison, and I could not get out. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I knew I had to find a way to get back. I just didn't know how. Story 2, I couldn't believe this was happening. No, not even that. I couldn't believe I was here in this situation 6 months ago. If someone had told me I'd be holding some fat, gray-haired man's severed thumb, that I'd be desperate enough to cut it off, I'd have just laughed and asked them to think of something more rational. Yes, I've always loved getting into weird situations. It's like a drug, making yourself feel alive through risk, through the impossible. But I couldn't have imagined this. It wasn't an accident. But someone had to see it. Someone had to realize that everything that was happening now was not an accident, but a pattern. I didn't know how I got here. I didn't know who this man in front of me was. Just a fat, white-haired man who, as it turned out, was stupid enough to be the catalyst for this crazy scene. As I kicked him in the side, I saw his body go rigid, his eyes filled with a silent question. But I couldn't go back. I didn't know why I did it, but I could tell it was out of my control. I wasn't that kind of person. I was careful. I always knew where my line was. Today, there was no line. I pressed the flashlight into his chest with such force that his rib cage gave out, and he fell to the ground like a sack of potatoes. There was no fear in his eyes, only confusion. But all of this was just the beginning. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop. I grabbed his wrist, not giving him a chance. He tried to pull away, but I pressed his hand into the ground. And the moment he tried to rise, I drove my finger into his flesh, right into the meat. It was strange. I felt his skin tearing, and something inside me instantly decided that I needed to do more. He couldn't move, and neither could I. Everything around him, including his emotions, froze in emptiness. The moment I took the knife, I felt the world around me disappear. I was no longer a part of what had been. Each moment became less meaningful. First a small movement, then a quick downward movement, and I cut off his finger with surgical precision. In that moment I felt no satisfaction, no grief. I felt nothing at all, except for one thought: I can't stop. Blood poured onto the ground, and his hand hung limply at his side. This man was my enemy, and I was sure that this moment was the end of his fight. But he still didn't scream. He didn't scream. I waited for him to scream, like a man who can't understand what's happening to him. He just sat there, clenching his teeth and trying to hold back the tears. He couldn't help but feel the pain. He had to, but he didn't react. I brought the knife to his shoulder, making a neat cut again, and thought, now it's complete. But his gaze was so calm that it left me speechless. He looked at the ground, as if he knew he had already lost. I dropped my finger on the ground and stood there, feeling the adrenaline drain away, leaving me with an invisible void. Why did I do that? Why couldn't I stop? The thought only occurred to me as I took his finger and quickly wrapped it in a towel. It was strange how easy it was. I just closed my eyes and concentrated, not allowing myself to feel guilty, not allowing myself to think about the consequences. I was just a machine doing a task. But when the man jerked his head up, I knew he might finally understand. He looked at me with an expression that made me feel a little uneasy. It wasn't fear. No, he wasn't afraid. It was something far more cruel, the realization that all his efforts were pointless. We both knew he wouldn't survive. And at that moment, I wasn't sure who was cruel, him or me. Maybe it was all part of my own internal struggle, a struggle I had been avoiding for years. Fear. It wasn't in his eyes, it was in me. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to stop, but it was too late. He grabbed the phone and shoved it in his pocket, and I thought he would try to call someone to find a way out, but his movements were slow, like a man who has been looking for salvation for too long and has finally realized that salvation is just a mirage. Before I could look away, I heard him give in. He wasn't screaming. He was just looking at the ground, his eyes devoid of hope or anger. I kept looking at him, knowing that nothing depended on me anymore. I could continue threatening him. I could repeat my words, which, incidentally, no longer mattered. Instead, I stood up and said, "You're no longer an obstacle to me. Just disappear." It was a game. I couldn't even say I felt like I was winning. In fact, I just wanted to leave. And I left without even looking back. Suddenly it seemed to me that the whole world, all the mess I had found myself in, was nothing more than a cheap show in which I was just an extra. Only, despite all my efforts, I couldn't leave the stage. When I walked away, my heart was still beating at the same speed, but there was no longer any fear. There was only a feeling that I had finally found my way, although I did not fully know where it led. I woke early, almost immediately after the first rays of light broke through the curtains. My head was buzzing, and my body was heavy from the night before. But the sleep was strange, light, almost as if I had not slept at all. The whole night was a blur of memories that did not become clearer, but on the contrary, blurred. I could not understand where my thoughts began and where they ended. Everything was mixed up: actions, feelings, images. When I stood up, the room seemed different. Everything around me felt out of place. Even the air was different. I tried to take a sip of water, but I felt the bitterness tightening in my throat, like the taste of something I hated, something I had once experienced. I squeezed the bottle and put it back on the table. My gaze caught on the mirror. I saw myself, but it wasn't me. It was something alien, elusive. I think I looked as if I had woken up not in my own body, but in someone else's, abandoned and empty. I remembered lying on the floor, a pool of blood spreading across the surface. It was all so real that now, In the morning silence, the feeling of uncertainty in my own actions only grew stronger. I looked around the room. The whole house was in the same condition as it had been the day before. Everything was in its place, but something was wrong. It wasn't just disorder, it was some kind of internal disorganization. I felt that there was nothing normal about these walls, and I seemed to be part of this abnormality too. My hands began fiddling nervously with the objects on the table. It was one of those moments when I was searching for something but didn't know what it was. A feeling of inadequacy, as if I had forgotten a key link in a chain of events, but all my attempts to remember only added to the emptiness. My brain refused to work as usual. It was exhausted, as was I. I didn't know what to do with it. I decided to go outside. Fresh air. It was cold and sharp. It seemed to cut me off from this blurry world. Everything looked the same as before, the same road, the same houses, the same dull greenery, but now it all seemed to be perceived through some kind of filter, as if I were observing everything from the outside. I walked and couldn't understand what had happened to my life. What had I done? Why had I become part of all this? The questions didn't make sense because there were no answers. I felt like there was fear waiting for me around every corner, and the further I walked, the stronger the feeling became. There was an inescapable, anxious rhythm growing inside me, as if someone was walking behind me, but I couldn't see them. When I got home, my legs were heavy. I felt everything around me thickening like a dark veil that wouldn't let go. It was time to do something, but I didn't know what. Everything continued to press. The hours dragged on, but brought no relief. I sat down at the table again, trying to make sense of what was happening. It felt like there was no place left where I could hide from what was haunting me. My thoughts were tangled, like a ball of thread from which it was impossible to find the end. I couldn't figure out if this was the consequence of an action or the beginning of something else. But one thing was clear. I couldn't get rid of this. It haunted me like a shadow, and I knew I had to live with it. Then I noticed a message on my phone. Someone was writing, but I didn't know what exactly. I wasn't ready for these words, but just in case I read it. Someone at some point wanted to remind me that this wasn't just a coincidence, that this whole story was inevitable. My vision clouded over again, and the fear I had tried to suppress crept through my body again. I realized that everything that had happened was just the beginning, and there was no escaping it. I didn't know what lay ahead, but at some point it became clear to me there was no turning back. As I sat in the dark room, the light slowly dimmed outside the windows. The sky seemed to be in some other reality. Everything around me, including me, seemed to be caught in a sticky web from which it was impossible to escape. I looked at the clock, but the time did not matter. It was just another reminder that nothing had changed, although I had long wanted everything to be different. My thoughts were disconnected from reality, as if I was reliving the same moment over and over again. I saw the man I had met a few days ago. His face, his eyes, the strange look he gave me. He was part of something bigger than I could have imagined. And the more I tried to let go of that image, the more it clung to me. I felt his presence beginning to wrap around me, like long tentacles ready to tear the last bit of will out of me at any moment. My legs ached, and I felt the pressure on my head making it hard to concentrate. I stood in the room, but it felt like I was somewhere else, in the basement of my own psyche, surrounded by walls that grew narrower with every breath. Every step, every look, every movement, it all felt heavy, as if I was carrying an unbearable weight on my shoulders that I couldn't throw off. I tried to get up, but my body was not as obedient as usual. It seemed to resist every movement, as if something was holding me in place. I felt tension in every muscle, and every step I took sent pain through my entire body. It was excruciating. I felt like I was chained, but not in a physical sense. Everything around me was dead and closed. I could not free myself. I could not get out. And this fact was much more terrible than the pain itself. Every time I tried to focus on what was happening, everything around me became less real. The walls disappeared, and I was in a void. But the void wasn't empty. It was filled with something. Maybe fear, maybe guilt, maybe something I couldn't even comprehend. Everything was mixed up, and I seemed to lose track of where I ended, and this strange, unfamiliar feeling began. There were thoughts in my head that were bothering me, but that I couldn't voice. I tried to find words, but I couldn't. Everything was broken, mixed up. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Doubts that had seemed frivolous before were now growing like a snowball, rolling and destroying everything in their path. At that moment, I realized that what had happened could not be forgotten. It was not just an accident, not a chance meeting with a person. It was something much more significant than just an incident. It changed me. Everything. I could not find the starting point from which everything went wrong. And the more I thought about it, the clearer one thing became. I was no longer the same person I used to be. I was different. I did not know what I was now, but I was sure that it was forever. The noise in the room began to grow. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't real noise. It was just echo sounds that echoed each other but had no source. They were part of me, part of this chaos. And this chaos was inside me now, eclipsing my thoughts, my feelings. I tried to sit up, but it didn't bring me relief. I couldn't stay in one place. I couldn't sit still. Every impulse I had was met with doubt. Everything was part of a big mechanism in which I had become a cog, and this mechanism kept moving. I was unable to stop it, and every time I tried to understand what was happening, every time I tried to find even a small part of the answer, it only made things more difficult. It was as if I was trying to break a chain that was binding me, but I didn't know which side to start with. I opened the window. The air was cool and fresh, but it still couldn't disperse this thick, heavy fog in my head. I tried to think, but I couldn't. My consciousness was foggy, as if someone had closed all the windows, leaving me in emptiness. And then I felt it again, that look. It was everywhere. It was penetrating me, and I couldn't figure out what to do with it. It was so strong that I couldn't even get rid of the sounds of the street. I felt this presence watching me, following my every move, and it was getting harder and harder to breathe. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to go, but where? I didn't know what I was looking for. There were no people around, no answers. I only knew one thing: I couldn't go back. When I opened my eyes again, the world looked different. It seemed as if someone had pushed me out of my usual existence, and now I was part of something huge and inexplicable. At first it seemed like a deception, an empty dream, but soon I realized that what was happening had nothing to do with illusions. The whole reality had changed, and I found myself at its very center. My body, my thoughts, everything in this world seemed to have changed, but I still could not understand how exactly. I stood in a dark hallway, its walls coated in what looked like old rust, and it filled the air with a pungent metallic smell. And despite the emptiness that reigned around me, I knew that I was not alone. Someone was creating this feeling. He was close, but he remained out of sight. Their footsteps echoed down the narrow passage. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they were there, getting closer and closer, as if someone was approaching me, as if I was surrounded by an invisible net. My gaze fell on something strange. I found myself next to a mirror, but it wasn't just a mirror. It seemed to be pulsating. It was alive, reflecting not only my face, but also something more. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, this mirror began to show something else. My face seemed to be the same, but there was a strange, unnatural distortion to it. I saw myself, but not as I was. In the reflection I seemed old, tired, as if my whole life had slipped out of me in that moment of change of gaze, leaving only a shell. This was not just a reflection, it was something much more terrible. Something that looked at me and did not let go. There was a noise in my head. It wouldn't stop, like someone was saying something, but the words weren't fully getting through to my mind. My gaze slid to the mirror again, and I saw how its surface began to pulse, as if something was trying to break free. Something jagged and wrong. I stepped back, and in that moment the mirror changed. It no longer reflected me. It became something alive, as if embracing the space around it, and then it reflected something I hadn't expected to see. The very man who had been stalking me from the start. His eyes weren't just looking at me, they were piercing through me, and I felt a cold fear seep into every cell of my body. My gaze was drawn to his face, which was becoming clearer, and I felt his presence growing stronger. It wasn't physical, it was mental. I instinctively jumped away from the mirror. Its surface became normal again, unremarkable. But in my head there was still that terrible trace, its image like a shadow that you can't erase. I didn't know what to do. All the decisions I had once made now seemed insignificant in front of this nightmare. Looking around, I realized that I had lost all orientation. Everything around me was so changeable and frightening that it was difficult for me to believe in my ability to return. No matter how much I tried to look for an answer, nothing came out. All reality was confused, blurred. That person, that look, all of it was pulling me back into an unknown dark part of this world, into a place I could not understand. Everything I saw in the mirror now haunted me. I felt it like a weight that was pressing down on me, forcing me to walk in circles, as if I were trapped and didn't know how to escape. Every turn, every step, every action, everything became part of this vicious circle. And that's when I realized that all of this mattered, that what I saw, what I felt, was no accident. It was something that kept following me, not letting me forget, not letting me retreat. I couldn't be who I was anymore. I couldn't go back. And perhaps the scariest thing was that I wasn't clear on what it was I was looking for, what it was I was trying to escape. Now I knew that I was being watched, that I couldn't just forget what had happened. I couldn't forget the look in the mirror that was becoming clearer with each passing day, with each step. And the only thing left was to move on, hoping that one day I would find a way out of this endless nightmare. The world around me changed. It seemed like my whole life had become a blur, where every morning I would start with a heavy feeling in my chest and a sense that someone was following me. I couldn't focus. The fear I felt was almost physical, as if I was tied by an invisible rope to something that was pulling me into the void. My thoughts began to become confused and reality began to lose its meaning. I woke up with a feeling that this time everything would be different. Even the air in the room seemed different, as if it were saturated with something invisible that was waiting for me in the shadows. I tried to look at the world through my usual lens again, but I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't figure out where reality ended and something else, something much more frightening, began. I stood up and walked to the window. The outside world was as gray and empty as my mind. The trees on the horizon seemed lifeless, their branches motionless, as if they had stopped in their eternal path. But I knew that something had changed in this world. Something was hiding, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Footsteps outside the door caught my attention. They were quiet, but clearly audible. I couldn't describe what they sounded like, but there was an unnatural rhythm, as if someone was trying not to make the slightest noise, but still inevitably broke the silence. I felt my heart pounding and froze, unable to move. Those footsteps weren't just sounds. They were someone moving in my footsteps. At that moment I realized that I was no longer alone, and perhaps I never was. I turned around, but saw nothing. The shadow that slid across the wall disappeared so quickly that I barely had time to understand what it was. Or was I imagining it? Maybe it was a play of imagination dictated by my inner fears, but everything in my soul told me that it was not. With every step I took, the feeling that something was watching me grew stronger. I felt tension filling every cell of my body. My hands were shaking, and the air felt thick and heavy, as if I was breathing through some kind of barrier. I didn't know how far I could go before those invisible footprints finally caught up with me. I started walking down the corridor, although I knew that I could not escape this fear. The noise of footsteps continued to accompany me, and I understood that I could not get away from it. These shadows were always nearby, but I could not understand how they moved, how they were in this place where there seemed to be no living beings. Suddenly, I came across one of the doors that I hadn't noticed before. It was hidden in a corner, surrounded by darkness. I walked up to it and, without thinking, opened it. There was a room behind the door, but there was nothing familiar about it. It was empty, but there was a strange smell in the air that made me cough. I stepped over the threshold and stopped. This room did not belong to this world. Too much time had passed since anyone had dared to enter here, and now it served only as a place for shadows, for those who had long been lost in this dark place. And yet, I felt that these shadows were more than just empty space. It was a trace, it was death that hung over me. I saw how the walls gradually began to move, as if they were alive. Something made me breathe deeply, smelling the death that hung thickly over this room. I realized that there was something here that wouldn't let me just leave. I had to stay, to understand what was happening. I felt like I was having trouble breathing and my eyes started to water. This wasn't just space. It was a trap. I walked further into the room and suddenly something moved in the darkness. I froze in place, trying to catch even the slightest noise, but there was nothing. The silence returned again, but it was even more oppressive. I couldn't look into the darkness. I knew that if I looked, I would see her, the one hiding there, in the shadows, the one watching me. My steps became more and more cautious. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end and my heart began to pound in my chest again. It felt like someone was standing behind me, but when I turned around, I saw no one. I didn't know how much time had passed, but at some point I realized that the door I had entered through had disappeared. It had dissolved, as if it had never been there. I was standing in an empty, dark room where the walls were moving, but there were no doors or windows. I was trapped. The silence surrounded me, and it seemed to be shrinking, growing denser until it filled the entire space. I stood there unsure of what to do. Every step I took led nowhere. I could find no way out, and the walls that had seemed motionless before were now warping into sinister shapes. They were alive, and I began to feel every detail of this world shifting, twisting, and bending around me. Almost without realizing what I was doing, I took a few steps forward, watching the room around me change with every movement. Suddenly the air became muffled, as if all sound had been swallowed up by the darkness itself, and the world around me had sunk into an unimaginable void. I tried to look into the dark corners, but no place responded. Not a single shadow, only emptiness. I felt something trying to break out from the depths of this space, something that was on the edge ready to break free. I felt a growing tension, as if the darkness itself was stretching out its arms to me, ready to swallow me whole. Something invisible but tangibly powerful was growing around me. My thoughts began to spin, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't break out of this vicious circle. It seemed that I was not only lost in space, but also in my own head. Time had lost its meaning for me. I didn't know how long I had been here, how long I had been standing there, trying to figure out what was happening. It could have been an hour or a century. All I knew was that I needed to survive, and I didn't know how. I took a step to the side, but the air around me seemed to be compressing. My legs felt heavy, as if an invisible hand was resting on them. I felt them begin to move, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of pressure. I wasn't just lost in this place. I was trapped, caught by whatever was lurking in these shadows, by whatever was preventing me from getting out. I was sure there was nothing alive here, but this world seemed to be alive. It was breathing, and its breath was cold, threatening. I knew that if I stopped, if I rested, I would be swallowed up by this world forever. I couldn't afford to lose control. Afraid to even blink, I kept moving forward, trying not to give in to fear. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, I felt something change. I couldn't say what, but I was being looked at, not from the outside, but from the inside, and that was much scarier. It wasn't just a threat. It was as if the entire space had become a part of me, as if I had become a part of this obscurantism. With every step I took, I became more and more disconnected from reality. I no longer knew what was right or wrong. I didn't know what this place was really like, what was happening to it or to me. All I felt was this endless, crushing feeling that I was on the edge, on the brink. I had to find a way out, but there was no way, no answers. I was lost, and the darkness was consuming me. Then I felt something soft touch my face. A light touch, almost imperceptible, but I felt it pass over my skin, as if someone invisible was reaching out to me. I froze, not daring to move, but the shadow continued to move around, getting closer. And suddenly, as if from afar, I felt it, a dark, cold entity. I could not see it, but it was close. The sensation was unbearable. My chest tightened, as if I was on the verge of suffocation. It was something far more terrifying than anything I had ever experienced. It was not just a creature. It was something that could devour an entire being, anyone caught in its field. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the fear only grew. I couldn't let myself give in. I couldn't let this consume me. Suddenly I realized that the only way out was to not give in. I had to fight through this horrible feeling that was slowly taking over me. I opened my eyes. Shadows began to dance before me, and I took a step forward. The dark entity was already close, but I knew that if I did not give in, I could break free. I moved despite my own anxiety and fear, and in that moment I realized that this world could not defeat me. I could not let it consume me. But something still held me back. The shadow was getting closer, and I realized again that for this world I was no longer just a part. I was a part of it forever. Without knowing how much time had passed, I continued to move down the dark corridor that seemed to have no end. It seemed like a place where space and time lost their meaning, as if every movement it made drained me. I could feel the air around me growing thicker, as if I was sinking into something unknowable that was eating me up from the inside. With every step, the darkness grew thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching my every move. I tried not to think about what was happening, not to think about what was around me, but the thoughts still came. I felt my consciousness slowly but surely going into this world of darkness, how it was swallowing everything around me, capturing me, depriving me of the ability to move. I tried again and again to find a way out, but I could not, and there was not a single sound that could help me. At one point, when I had almost given up hope, I felt something strange. It was like a presence. It wasn't physical, but I knew it was there. I tried not to think about it, tried to ignore it, but it became more and more obvious, like a shadow following me. I moved forward, not daring to stop, afraid that this something might grab me if I dared to linger. In this chaos of thoughts, I felt completely lost, without any control over my mind. It seemed to me that I was losing myself, becoming part of something much more sinister and alien than I could have imagined. And in that moment, I realized that this something was not a part of me. It was something external, but it affected me as strongly as if I myself were a part of its darkness. I felt my strength begin to drain. It felt like this world was swallowing me up, and there was no place to escape. I was surrounded, cut off from all life. My legs felt like stone, and every step became harder. The darkness and its cold touch were becoming unbearable, and despite my attempts to hold on, I began to realize that I could not escape what was waiting for me. Suddenly, I felt something touch my shoulder. It wasn't a touch, but a feeling of someone or something invisible, but alive squeezing me. Panic gripped me and I turned around abruptly, but I saw nothing, only emptiness. However, the feeling didn't go away, it only became brighter, and I felt this something penetrate my soul as if it had become a part of me. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't get out. I was consumed by this place, this world. It was more than just darkness. It was like an invisible force that controlled everything, and I was under its control. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to resist, but despite the fear, I kept moving. My mind was trying to find a way out, trying to find something that would help me cope with what was happening around me. But I knew that every step I took could be my last. I could feel this force approaching, pressing on me, and I felt it in my chest, in my mind. And that's when I realized that there was no point in fighting. I couldn't fight it because it was already inside me. It had consumed me so much that I had become part of it, but I still couldn't give in. At some point, I realized that I wouldn't be able to get out alive, that I would have to become part of this darkness, but I still held on. I stood in complete silence, as if merging with this world. And then came the realization that this darkness was not just consuming me, it was filling me. And despite all this, I suddenly felt as if the world itself was looking at me. Realizing that I was now a part of it, I gritted my teeth, taking another step forward, and that was the moment I realized, if the darkness wanted to devour me, it would get me. But at the same time, I would not allow myself to give up without a fight. I would become part of this force, but I would fight to the end.